I want to discuss an interesting article written by an author who has studied Vladimir Putin. Her name is Rebecca Koffler. Her book is called Putin's Playbook, Russia's Secret Plan to Defeat America. And she has an article in the New York Post, which kind of made me chuckle when I first read the title. It's called How Putin's Rat-Infested Childhood Shaped His Philosophy on War. And I'll get to the article in a moment. Now, you can make what you will of it. But in general, I'm not a fan of this mode of reasoning. I'm calling it the psychological attempt, often delving back into childhood. It's things like, Hitler was unloved as a child. Mussolini didn't receive proper toilet training. This kind of attempt to account for the behavior of world leaders, I think, is generally a little bit suspect. But what I find interesting about this article is it does contain some details about Putin, the man. And as I say, the impact of these kind of anecdotes on his behavior now, I'll leave you to sort of figure out. Apparently, Putin grew up poor. Now, in this, he was not unusual. Soviet communism was a complete disaster. There were shortages of all kinds of basic goods. You lived in cramped, rat-infested apartments, and Putin was no exception. He was apparently a young thug on the streets of Russia, and he lived in a communal apartment in what was then Leningrad. And many other families kind of shared bathrooms. They had no individual bathrooms, and no hot water, and apparently a rather malodorous toilet. And Putin, in fact, would describe, this is coming, by the way, out of Putin's own memoirs, which are called First Person. Putin talks about when he'd run up the stairs to go to the bathroom, there were rats all over the place, and Putin with a stick would have to fight off these rats and run away from them. And after a while, he kind of almost got into a battle, apparently, with these rats. So he would face them and they would attack him, and then he would swat them away. And he, according to this article, got the idea here that the way to beat these rats was never to retreat. That the more you back off, the more they kind of keep swarming at you. And so it's a metaphor, of course, for Putin's philosophy that you've got to keep pushing forward because you're in a desperate struggle for survival. Now, we do know that Putin, and this is mentioned in the article, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Putin got the feeling that essentially the ground had been pulled out from under him. Here's a guy who had made advances in the KGB under the communist system. Suddenly the system itself is gone, and he felt a sense of vertigo. In fact, he even talks about it as a terminal disease without a cure, a kind of paralysis of power. Now, one interesting set of details in the article, Rebecca Koffler's article, is she talks about the fact that Putin was emotionally very affected by both the death of Saddam Hussein as well as the death of Gaddafi. Saddam Hussein, you remember, was captured by U.S. soldiers in 2003. And apparently Putin has spoken of this event. He's spoken about how he would sort of stare at Saddam Hussein's, at pictures of Saddam Hussein's body. He'd see that his eyes were partly open, his neck was kind of distorted. And Putin has referred to this as a very barbaric act on the part of the United States. And then very much in the same vein, you might remember Hillary Clinton gloating over the death of Gaddafi. We came, we saw, he died, that kind of thing. And Putin has commented about Gaddafi being trapped in a kind of drain and likened it to being a rat. You're like a rat who's trapped in a drain under a highway. And then he was killed before his security guards could get him to the hospital. And for Putin, apparently, there's a kind of fear that this would be his fate, that this could happen to him. And so as a result, Putin is obsessed, it seems, with power, with conquest, with not backing down, with making sure that he's not in a position of weakness, similar to Gaddafi, similar to to Saddam Hussein that would enable him to be at the mercy of a power like the United States in this way. So again, to me, this is all very interesting. I actually didn't know these details about Putin's childhood. I'm relaying them because I think that they're interesting in and of themselves. But whether or not they provide any adequate explanation for who Putin is now, how he really thinks about the world, I think is something that we can just sort of ponder. My own way of thinking is mainly to look at these powers, China, Russia, in terms of really two factors. The first is the underlying ideology that governs the state. In the case of China, of course, it's a certain peculiar form of Marxism-Leninism. In the case of Putin, it's nothing more than a kind of mafioso gangsterism. And then on the other hand, just look at the power politics driving all this. In this case, a big power, Russia, being intolerant or not being willing to live with a Ukraine that is on its border and is in any way hostile to Russia's objectives in the region. So for me, Vladimir Putin is explained less by his own personal psychology and more by what you could call reasons of state.